I realized I had already been replaced when my sister said my name without lowering her voice, as if it no longer belonged to me. She was standing in the kitchen, one hand resting on the counter, the other holding her phone, speaking with the calm certainty of someone making arrangements that would not be questioned. I was only a few steps away, just out of sight, close enough to hear the soft click of her nail against the screen as she scrolled. She didn't sound rushed. She didn't sound unsure. She sounded settled. "She won't need to be there," she said. "I'll handle it." There was a pause. Someone murmured agreement. Another voice added something about how this was probably easier for everyone. I remember waiting for the moment when she would lower her voice or glance around or hesitate. She did none of those things. My name passed through the room the way an object does when it's already been decided where it belongs. That was when it hit me. This wasn't gossip anymore. This wasn't whispering behind my back or speculation about my health or my choices. This was planning. Real planning. Appointments, decisions, things that directly affected my life, all being discussed with an ease that suggested I had already been removed from the equation. I stood there and said nothing, not because I didn't hear her, but because I heard everything. After the story about me faking illness had spread through the family, something shifted that no one ever acknowledged out loud. It showed up in smaller ways first. Conversations stopped when I walked into a room. People asked how I was feeling in a tone that sounded more like assessment than concern. My sister especially began to look at me differently, like someone who had taken on a responsibility she hadn't asked for but didn't intend to give back. She was good at it too. Organized, calm, the kind of person who spoke in complete sentences and made things sound reasonable. When she talked, she didn't sound cruel. She sounded capable, and that made everything more dangerous. The first decision I found out about after it had already been made seemed minor on the surface. A change to a schedule, a rearranged appointment, something that could easily be framed as helpful. When it was mentioned casually at the table, my sister spoke as if we had already discussed it. "We decided this would work better for her," she said, not looking at me. No one corrected her. No one asked when that conversation had happened. A few heads nodded, relieved that someone had taken charge. I felt the familiar instinct rise in my chest, the urge to clarify, to say that no one had asked me, that this wasn't what I wanted, that I was sitting right there. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. For a moment I wasn't sure why I stopped myself. I just knew that something about the timing felt wrong. Speaking now would have put me on the defensive immediately. It would have turned the focus to my tone, my emotions, my supposed sensitivity. I had learned that lesson before. As the conversation moved on without me, I began to notice other things. A shared calendar updated without my input. Plans discussed in past tense, as if consensus had already been reached. My sister answering questions about me before I had the chance to respond. This wasn't a single oversight. It was a pattern. I thought back to other moments, other times I had pushed back when I felt misunderstood. Those memories came with the same ending every time. I was told I was overreacting, that I was making things harder than they needed to be, that everyone was just trying to help. Being right had never protected me. It had only made me look difficult. Sitting there, listening to my life being summarized incorrectly, I understood something that made my stomach drop and my mind sharpen at the same time. I wasn't being consulted because they no longer believed I needed to be. My sister wasn't stepping in temporarily. She was stepping over me, and she was doing it carefully, in full view of everyone, wrapped in language that sounded like care. I felt a strange calm settle over me then. Not acceptance, not defeat. Something colder and clearer. If I spoke now, I would expose what I knew too early. If I stayed quiet, I could see how far she was willing to go. So I chose silence. Not the kind that comes from fear, but the kind that comes from calculation. I started listening differently. Not as someone hoping to be included again, but as someone gathering information. I paid attention to who spoke first and who echoed them. I noticed when decisions were framed as already settled. I watched how easily my sister's confidence filled the space I left behind. By the end of the evening, she was speaking about my life as if it were a shared project she had been assigned. People thanked her for taking care of things. Someone even said it must be a relief for me. I smiled and nodded. I didn't correct them, because what they didn't realize was that every assumption they made about my silence was teaching me something about them, and about her. She thought my quiet meant I hadn't noticed. She thought it meant I had accepted being pushed aside. She had no idea that this was the first time I had ever truly been paying attention. No one asked me if I was okay after that night. That was the first thing I noticed. The silence that followed my own wasn't concern or caution or even discomfort. It was efficiency. The space I had stepped back from was filled almost immediately, as if everyone had been waiting for permission they no longer needed. My sister noticed it first. I could see it in the way she watched me out of the corner of her eye the next morning, waiting for a reaction that never came. When I didn't challenge her version of events, something in her posture relaxed. She straightened, just slightly, like someone who had been handed responsibility and decided she liked how it felt. By the end of the week, she had stopped phrasing things as suggestions. "She's better with afternoons," she said during a phone call I overheard. "Mornings are too much for her right now." No one questioned how she knew that. No one asked me. At first, it happened in small ways. She answered messages meant for me. She confirmed plans before I had even heard about them. When someone asked how I was feeling, she replied before I could, her tone gentle but final. "She's managing," she said. "We've got a system now." The word "we" caught my attention. It suggested agreement, collaboration, consent, none of which had actually taken place. What unsettled me most wasn't her confidence. It was how quickly everyone else accepted it. Our parents listened with relief, grateful that someone seemed to have things under control. Other relatives nodded along, their interest satisfied by the appearance of order. It was easier to trust her than to slow down and check in with me, and I let it happen. The first time she announced a decision in front of everyone, I almost laughed at how carefully she had chosen the moment. We were gathered casually, the mood light enough that any objection would have felt disruptive. She spoke as if she were sharing a conclusion we had reached together. "We'll move things around," she said. "It's better this way." She didn't look at me. She didn't need to. The sentence had already been accepted by the time it finished. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the urge to correct the record before it hardened into fact. But I could also feel something else now, something steadier. I saw how speaking up in that moment would have framed me as ungrateful, resistant, difficult. I would have been interrupting a solution, not defending my autonomy. So I stayed quiet. That quiet started to work in her favor faster than I expected. People began turning to her automatically when my name came up. She answered questions that weren't directed at her. She summarized my needs, my limitations, my preferences, all with the smooth authority of someone who had rehearsed the lines. "She doesn't like surprises anymore," she said once, smiling. "This is just easier." Easier for who, I wondered. I watched our parents' faces as she spoke. There was no malice there, just relief. Relief that they didn't have to navigate uncertainty, or ask uncomfortable questions, or risk getting it wrong. My sister offered them clarity, and they accepted it gratefully. One of my relatives caught my eye during one of these exchanges. She looked away almost immediately, like someone who had seen something she didn't want to name. That look stayed with me. It told me I wasn't imagining the shift. Others could feel it too. They just weren't willing to challenge it. As days passed, my sister's role expanded. She began using my silence as evidence of agreement. "We talked about it," she said more than once, even when we hadn't. And because I didn't correct her, the statement went unchallenged. I realized then how dangerous silence could look from the outside. It didn't read as restraint, it read as consent. And she benefited from that misunderstanding. People thanked her, complimented her for being proactive. Someone said it was good I had her looking out for me. Each word of praise seemed to settle into her, reinforcing the idea that she was doing the right thing, that she deserved this authority. It became clear that she wasn't just managing logistics anymore. She was enjoying the position it put her in, the attention, the validation, the way decisions flowed through her instead of around me. That was when she crossed a line she didn't realize I was watching. It happened quietly, the way most irreversible things do. She mentioned a change she had already initiated, something that affected more than my schedule, something that touched my body, my future, my ability to decide for myself. She spoke about it casually, as if it were already settled, already approved. I felt the room tilt, just slightly. No one asked me if I agreed. No one even glanced in my direction. The assumption had already been made that my silence meant permission. I understood then that this wasn't a misunderstanding I could clear up later. This was a takeover, unfolding in plain sight, fueled by confidence and convenience. Still, I said nothing. Not because it didn't matter, but because now it mattered too much. I could see how far she was willing to go when she believed I wouldn't stop her. And for the first time, I realized that letting her believe that might be the most powerful position I could take. She thought she was filling in for me. She didn't understand that she was replacing me, and she had no idea how much that misunderstanding was going to cost her. The words were already forming in my mouth when I stopped myself. My sister had just finished explaining a decision she had no right to make, her voice calm, assured, final. I felt the familiar heat rise in my chest, the instinctive need to correct her, to say that she was wrong, that she didn't speak for me, that I was standing right there. My jaw tightened. I took a breath. And then I didn't say anything. That pause was new. It wasn't hesitation or fear, it was recognition. I recognized the pattern before I stepped into it again. I had defended myself before, many times, and every single time it had ended the same way. I remembered one afternoon months earlier, before everything turned quiet and careful. We were sitting around the dining table, papers spread out, voices already tense. My sister had suggested something about my health, something she framed as concern but delivered like a verdict. I corrected her, calmly at first. I explained what I wanted, what I had already discussed with my doctor, what made sense for me. She tilted her head and sighed, just slightly. "You're getting worked up," she said. "We're just trying to help." That was all it took. The conversation shifted instantly. My words stopped being information and became evidence of a problem. My tone was dissected. My emotions were questioned. Someone said I needed to relax. Someone else said stress wasn't good for me. The original issue disappeared under a pile of commentary about how I was reacting instead of what I was saying. By the end of it, I was the only one apologizing. Sitting there now, in the present, I understood what that moment had taught everyone without my realizing it. When I spoke up, I gave them something easier to focus on than the truth. I gave them me. So, I stayed quiet. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I finally understood what speaking too soon cost me. Silence, I realized, wasn't absence. It was restraint. And restraint required more control than any argument I had ever made. As the days passed, I started paying attention in a way I never had before. Not emotionally, but strategically. I listened to how my sister phrased things when she thought no one would challenge her. I noticed how often she repeated the same decision, each time with slightly different wording, testing which version landed best. She wasn't as certain as she wanted everyone to believe. She was adjusting in real time. I noticed who backed her up immediately and who stayed quiet. I noticed who left the room when certain topics came up and who lingered just long enough to hear the conclusion. I started marking moments in my head, not with judgment, but with clarity. There was a cost to staying silent, though, and it wasn't small. There were moments when it felt humiliating, when someone talked about me like I wasn't there, and I let it happen. When my sister answered a question about my preferences incorrectly, and I swallowed the correction. Each time, a part of me wanted to scream that I was still a person, not a project. But every time that urge rose, I asked myself the same question. What happens after I speak? I knew the answer. The focus would shift. The conversation would become about my reaction, my tone, my supposed fragility. The decisions would still be made. Only now, I would be framed as the obstacle. So I let them misunderstand my silence. They thought I was overwhelmed, or tired, or resigned. My sister especially seemed to draw confidence from it. She began speaking more freely, explaining less, assuming more. She stopped checking my face for signs of resistance. She stopped waiting for me to leave the room before talking. And in that carelessness, she started revealing things she wouldn't have otherwise. I began to see how much of her authority rested on assumption rather than confirmation. How often she relied on the idea that what sounded reasonable didn't need to be verified. She spoke in summaries, not specifics. Conclusions, not processes. Once she said, "Everyone's on the same page," and glanced around the room as if daring anyone to disagree. No one did, but I noticed how she didn't actually look at anyone when she said it. I was losing my voice on purpose, and in exchange, I was hearing everything else. The fear that had kept me quiet at first slowly transformed into something steadier. Focus. Patience. I stopped thinking about how to correct the situation and started thinking about how it would inevitably expose itself. Because things built on assumption always do. By the end of that week, I felt different. Not smaller, not erased, sharper. I could feel my sister's confidence growing, but I could also see the cracks forming beneath it. The faster she moved, the less carefully she checked her footing. And I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that speaking now would only slow her down. So I stayed silent. Not because I had given up my place, but because I was waiting for her to forget that I was watching. My sister grew bolder the longer I stayed quiet. At first, it was subtle. She stopped checking whether I was in the room before discussing plans. She spoke with the ease of someone who no longer expected resistance, her sentences clean and confident, as if approval were a given. When I didn't interrupt, didn't correct, didn't even shift in my chair, she took that stillness as permission. It changed the way she carried herself. Her shoulders settled back, her voice lifted just enough to command attention. She began to move through conversations like someone with authority, not borrowed, but earned. And everyone around her adjusted accordingly. What used to sound like suggestions turned into conclusions. "This is what we'll do," replaced, "Maybe this would help." The difference was small, but it mattered. Language has weight. Once she realized no one would push back, she stopped cushioning her words. I watched how quickly that confidence spread. People repeated her phrases without thinking, as if her certainty had become contagious. When my name came up, it was followed by her voice, not mine. She summarized my needs, my limits, my preferences, all in a tone that suggested familiarity rather than assumption. "She doesn't handle stress well," she said once, smiling softly. "This is better for her." No one asked how she knew that. No one looked at me. What unsettled me most was how praise began to feed her momentum. Relatives thanked her for stepping up. Our parents leaned into her reassurance, relieved that someone seemed to have answers. The gratitude wasn't loud or dramatic. It was casual. That made it more powerful. It rewarded her for replacing me. I could feel the old instinct tug at me, the urge to interrupt before the narrative solidified. But I stayed still. I listened. And the more I listened, the more I noticed how much her confidence depended on never being questioned. Then came the decision she shouldn't have made. It wasn't announced with drama. There was no raised voice, no argument. She mentioned it the way people mention errands they've already run. A change she'd initiated. A step she'd taken. Something that affected more than logistics, more than schedules. Something that touched my body, my future, my ability to choose. She framed it as responsibility, as necessity, as something anyone reasonable would understand. "This had to be done," she said. "There wasn't time to wait." The room stayed quiet. No one asked what I thought. No one asked if I agreed. The assumption had already been made that my silence meant consent. I felt my stomach tighten, not with fear, but with clarity. This wasn't convenience anymore. This wasn't someone filling in temporarily. This was a line being crossed, cleanly and confidently, because she believed there would be no consequences. Still, I didn't speak. What hurt most in that moment wasn't the decision itself. It was how they talked about me while I was sitting right there. Not cruelly, not with anger, with calm efficiency, as if I were a subject to be managed rather than a person to be consulted. Someone corrected a small detail about me, something trivial but wrong. They didn't look at me when they did it. They looked at my sister. And she nodded, accepting the correction on my behalf. I had never felt so present and so invisible at the same time. Later, alone in my thoughts, I realized something that steadied me. Every unchallenged decision was teaching her how far she could go. Each time I stayed quiet, she learned that speed mattered more than accuracy, confidence more than confirmation. She began documenting things without checking, making notes, updating plans, referring to paperwork as if it were already complete. I noticed how often she assumed a signature existed simply because it should have. She was building something quickly, and quick builds always miss something. For the first time since all of this began, I stopped feeling small. Not because the situation improved, but because I understood it. Her boldness wasn't strength. It was momentum. And momentum, when it isn't guided, creates mistakes. I could see the false assumption at the center of everything she was doing. She believed my silence meant I had stopped paying attention, that I had checked out, that I was grateful to be relieved of responsibility. She couldn't imagine another reason. That misunderstanding gave me an unexpected sense of calm. I didn't need to confront her. I didn't need to expose anything yet. I only needed to let her continue believing what she already believed. Because confidence like hers, built on being unopposed, grows reckless. As days passed, she stopped asking questions altogether. She made plans and informed people afterward. She moved faster, spoke louder, explained less. The very traits that had earned her praise now made her sloppy. And I watched it happen without expression. I realized then that power doesn't always come from asserting yourself. Sometimes it comes from allowing someone else to reveal how much they assume, how little they check, how certain they are of things that have never been confirmed. She was getting bolder, and I was getting clearer. She thought my silence meant she had won. What she didn't understand was that I was no longer deciding whether to speak, I was deciding when. I stopped waiting to be included the morning I realized no one noticed I wasn't being asked anymore. The absence had become ordinary. Decisions moved around me like furniture I was expected to step around, not sit on. At first, I had waited for the moment someone would turn and say my name, invite my opinion, acknowledge my presence. That moment never came. And when it didn't, something in me settled. Once I stopped waiting for permission, I started noticing everything. Silence changed shape after that. It wasn't just the absence of words. It became a tool. I listened without reacting, even when my sister got details wrong. I didn't correct her timelines. I didn't clarify my preferences. I let inaccuracies pass through the room unchallenged and watched how quickly they hardened into facts. I began sorting what I heard into quiet categories. Who spoke first? Who echoed immediately? Who waited until someone else spoke before agreeing? I paid attention to timing, not content. To the pauses between sentences. To the way my sister would glance around the room before finishing a thought, gauging support before committing. The more confident she became, the less consistent she was. I noticed it one afternoon when she repeated the same plan to 2 different people, using slightly different reasons. Not enough to raise suspicion on its own, but enough to reveal uncertainty beneath the surface. She wasn't lying exactly. She was adjusting, saying whatever version felt safest in the moment. No one else seemed to catch it. The first piece of paper appeared not long after that. It was nothing dramatic. A printed schedule left casually on the counter. a few notes scribbled in the margin, my name typed neatly at the top. It was treated like proof, like something that settled the matter simply by existing. My sister referred to it without looking at me, as if the document spoke for both of us. I leaned closer, pretending to read something else. There was no signature, no confirmation, just assumption formatted to look official. That was when I understood how much power paper was being given without anyone checking what it actually said. From then on, I watched the way documentation was handled, how quickly something written down became decided, how easily a note turned into authorization. I noticed how often my sister referenced records she hadn't actually verified, trusting that form would substitute for consent. I also noticed who was present when those papers were discussed. Certain people always seemed to be around for the conclusions. Others drifted away just before decisions were made. It wasn't random. The same relatives excused themselves at the same moments, consistently absent when authority was asserted. Absence wasn't accidental, it was managed. One evening, as a conversation wrapped up faster than it should have, I caught a small inconsistency that changed the way I listened after that. A date didn't match. A reference was made to something that hadn't happened yet. It was minor, the kind of thing most people would ignore. I didn't. That tiny error told me everything I needed to know. It meant she was moving faster than her information, that she was assuming steps had been completed simply because they should have been. The system she was building relied on momentum, not verification. For the first time, I felt genuinely ahead. I didn't write anything down. I didn't take photos or save copies. I didn't leave a trail that could be traced back to me. Everything stayed where it was, in the open, exactly as she had left it. The truth didn't need my handwriting to exist. It only needed time. There were moments when staying silent felt unbearable, when my sister summarized my life inaccurately and people nodded along, when someone thanked her for making a decision I hadn't agreed to. Each time I felt the familiar urge to interrupt, to reclaim my voice before it disappeared completely. But I reminded myself of what speaking would cost. Correction would have shifted attention to me. Silence kept it where it belonged, on the gaps, on the assumptions, on the places where confidence was standing in for proof. I wasn't observing to understand anymore. I was observing to confirm. By then, my sister had stopped being careful altogether. She trusted that her authority was unquestioned. She referred to decisions as final before they were reviewed. She spoke about consent as if it were implied by proximity rather than granted explicitly. She was building a structure quickly, and she wasn't checking whether the foundation was level. I could see where it would fail. Not in a dramatic collapse, but in a quiet moment of scrutiny. A question asked by the wrong person. A record examined instead of assumed. The kind of moment that didn't care how confident someone sounded. That knowledge steadied me. They thought I was still trying to keep up. Still confused. Still grateful to have someone else handle things for me. I wasn't. I had stopped chasing clarity and started waiting for exposure. And as my sister moved faster, spoke louder, and documented more carelessly, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Prepared. The next decision would cross a line she couldn't talk her way back from. And when it did, I would still be silent. Just not invisible. The air changed before anyone said a word. I felt it the moment my sister sat down and placed her phone on the table, screen facing up, as if she expected it to be needed. Conversations slowed, voices softened, and there was a sense of preparation in the room that made my shoulders tighten. Some decisions arrive loudly. This one arrived already settled. She didn't ask for attention. She assumed it. "This had to be handled," she said, folding her hands together. "There wasn't time to wait." The words sounded reasonable, almost responsible. She spoke the way people do when they believe urgency absolves them of explanation. She framed it as care, as protection, as something any sensible person would understand once it was explained properly. "This is what's best for her right now," she added. "We can't keep delaying." No one interrupted. No one asked what I thought. The decision was presented as a conclusion, not a discussion. I listened carefully, because the way she said it mattered more than what she said. She avoided specifics. She leaned on implication. She let concern do the heavy lifting, trusting that no one would question something framed as necessity. But I understood immediately what the decision actually meant. It wasn't a schedule change. It wasn't a temporary adjustment. It affected my body, my future, my ability to make choices for myself. It crossed from coordination into control. And once crossed, that line couldn't simply be stepped back over. I felt a familiar heat rise in my chest, sharper than before. This wasn't just exclusion anymore. This was something being taken. Still, I didn't speak. I watched the room instead. The way our parents nodded, relieved to hear someone sound confident. The way a relative shifted uncomfortably but stayed silent. The way no one met my eyes. Their silence wasn't agreement. It was avoidance. Being present but treated as absent carries a particular kind of weight. You can feel yourself being erased in real time, your relevance shrinking as decisions solidify without you. It was the clearest confirmation yet that my voice had already been removed from the process. And that was when I drew a line, quietly, inside myself. I wouldn't break my silence yet. But this was no longer passive observation. This was preparation. As my sister continued explaining, she started repeating herself, adding details no one asked for, emphasizing urgency a little too much. It was subtle, but I noticed it. The first crack in her certainty. She glanced at me once quickly, then looked away. For the first time, she seemed aware that I was still there. That awareness didn't stop her. If anything, it made her press harder. She justified. She clarified. She spoke faster, as if speed could substitute for confirmation. It was a mistake. Because beneath her explanations was a flaw she hadn't noticed. She was assuming authority she didn't have. The decision relied on consent that had never been given, on approval that had been inferred rather than secured. She believed that because she had spoken confidently, because no one had challenged her, the ground beneath her was solid. It wasn't. I recognized the danger immediately. Not for me, but for her. The kind of danger that doesn't announce itself until the wrong person asks the right question. The kind that doesn't care how well-intentioned someone claims to be. That realization steadied me completely. I stopped feeling reactive. The anger cooled into focus. I understood now why staying quiet mattered. Speaking up in that moment would have shifted the conversation back to family dynamics, emotions, misunderstandings. Silence kept the decision exposed exactly where it was weakest. Process doesn't respond to confidence, it responds to verification. As the discussion moved on, my sister began talking about next steps, about paperwork, about follow-through. She spoke as if everything was already approved, already recorded, already final. She didn't check, she didn't confirm, she assumed. That assumption was the most dangerous thing she had done so far. I could see how this would end. Not with confrontation, not with raised voices, but with scrutiny. With someone outside this room, someone neutral, looking at what had been done and asking a simple question she wouldn't be able to answer. The knowledge didn't make me feel triumphant. It made me calm. When the conversation ended, people drifted away as if nothing significant had happened. But something had. A boundary had been crossed. A decision had been made that couldn't be undone quietly. My sister gathered her things, confident in the belief that she had taken control. She didn't realize that by moving so quickly, she had exposed everything she hadn't secured. I stayed seated, expression neutral, posture relaxed. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I didn't warn her. I didn't signal anything at all. Because at that point, my silence had changed again. It was no longer just observation. It was timing. She thought she had taken something from me that day. What she didn't understand was that she had handed me the moment when her certainty would finally be tested. The first interruption came from someone who had no history with us. She arrived without ceremony, introduced briefly, her presence shifting the rhythm of the room in a way I felt immediately. She didn't raise her voice or take control. She simply took a seat, opened a folder, and asked a question that sounded ordinary enough to pass unnoticed if you weren't listening closely. I was listening. Outsiders change things because they don't carry family loyalties. They don't know who usually speaks first or whose confidence fills the silence. They don't inherit assumptions. They look for procedures, not personalities. My sister adjusted instantly. Her tone softened, then sharpened into something polished and efficient. She smiled in the right places, nodded along, and spoke with the fluency of someone who believed she had already won the room. "I've been handling everything," she said easily. "We didn't want to overwhelm her." She gestured toward me without looking, as if I were an item she had already accounted for. The outsider nodded once, pen hovering over the page. "And when was the consent confirmed?" It was a simple question. Neutral, procedural. My sister answered too quickly. "Oh, we talked it through," she said. "She understands the situation." She filled the space before it could breathe. That was the mistake. The outsider paused, just long enough to register the answer without accepting it. I noticed the shift before anyone else did. It was subtle, but it mattered. The pen moved again, slower this time. "And is that documented?" she asked. The room tightened. My sister laughed softly, the sound light and reassuring. "It's all in progress. We didn't want to delay anything important." I watched the outsider's eyes move from my sister to the papers in front of her, then back again. She didn't argue. She didn't react. She simply asked another question. "Who completed the authorization?" This time my sister hesitated. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She answered with a general statement, something about procedures and understanding, but she didn't name anyone. She didn't reference a record. I felt something settle into place inside me. Not relief. Confirmation. As the questions continued, the dynamic in the room began to shift. My sister started speaking more, explaining more than was asked, layering context where clarity was needed. Family members who had been nodding earlier grew quieter, their attention drifting toward the outsider instead of her. Authority had changed hands without an announcement. I stayed silent, even as every instinct urged me to step in. This was the moment where speaking would have felt justified, even welcomed. But I knew better. If I spoke now, the focus would tilt back toward family tensions, toward emotions, toward history. I wanted the process to carry the weight, not my voice. The outsider noticed things before I ever said a word, the missing confirmations, the vague language, the way decisions were described without names attached to them. She asked follow-up questions with the same calm tone, each one narrowing the space my sister had to maneuver. The room reacted before I did. A chair shifted. Someone cleared their throat. Our parents exchanged a look that wasn't relief anymore. It was concern, not for me, but for themselves. For what this might mean. My sister sensed it too. I saw it in the way she straightened, in the way her explanations became more urgent. She began justifying instead of stating, clarifying instead of concluding. She had built her authority on confidence, and now that confidence was being measured against something it couldn't override. Process. At one point, the outsider said, "We'll need to verify that," and my sister froze for half a second too long. That was when she realized this wasn't private anymore. This wasn't something she could smooth over later with a conversation or a reassuring call. An external standard had entered the room, one that didn't bend to intention or tone, one that required confirmation, not assumption. I watched her recalibrate in real time, searching for ground that was no longer there. She glanced at me again, longer this time, as if trying to gauge whether I would intervene. I didn't meet her eyes. I didn't need to. The outsider continued, outlining next steps in the same neutral voice she had used from the start. Verify records, confirm authorizations, ensure proper consent. Each word landed softly, but together they formed something solid and unavoidable. No one argued. By the time the conversation ended, the room felt different. What had once been framed as a family matter now belonged to a system that didn't care about internal hierarchies. The certainty my sister had carried so confidently was gone, replaced by something fragile and reactive. As people stood and moved toward the door, conversations stayed muted. No one made eye contact with her. No one congratulated her for handling things so well. The praise she had grown accustomed to evaporated quietly. I remained seated, hands folded, expression unchanged. I hadn't said a word, and yet everything had shifted. She thought silence had protected her, that as long as I didn't object, her authority was secure. She hadn't realized whose silence actually mattered. It wasn't mine. It was the silence of someone who expected the records to speak for themselves. Confidence didn't disappear all at once. It stalled. The shift happened when the outsider stopped asking questions and started verifying answers. Her voice didn't change, but the room did. Conversation gave way to procedure, and suddenly words weren't enough. The folder on the table mattered more than tone, more than intention, more than how sure someone sounded. "Let's take a look at the record," she said. My sister reached for the papers with the ease of someone expecting confirmation. She slid them forward, still composed, still certain that whatever was written would match what she had been saying. She didn't look at me. She didn't need to. She believed the paper would do the speaking. The outsider scanned the first page, then the second. Her finger paused on a line that looked unremarkable to everyone else. I recognized it immediately. A space left blank. A confirmation assumed rather than completed. "Who signed here?" she asked. My sister answered without hesitation. She named a conversation, not a person. She described an understanding, not a record. She spoke as if agreement could be retroactive. The outsider nodded once, then flipped to another page. "And this authorization," she said calmly. "When was it confirmed?" My sister leaned forward, smile still in place, but the edges were tightening now. She explained again. She added context. She referenced urgency, care, necessity. Everything but the document itself. Paper doesn't respond to explanation. The outsider waited until my sister finished, then said something that landed harder than accusation ever could. "I don't see consent documented here." The sentence was neutral, unemotional, final. For the first time since this began, my sister didn't speak right away. I felt the moment settle into my body, not as triumph, but as grounding. This was real now. Not theoretical leverage, not something that depended on how the family felt about me. This was a discrepancy that existed regardless of anyone's intentions. My sister tried to fill the gap. "We discussed it," she said. She understood what needed to happen. The outsider looked up from the page and met her eyes. Understanding and consent aren't the same thing. Silence followed, sharper than before. Family members leaned in, not toward my sister this time, but toward the table, toward the paper. The thing that didn't care who usually spoke for whom. The thing that made assumptions visible. I stayed still. I didn't need to add anything. The truth didn't need my voice to stand. It was already standing on its own. The outsider continued, flipping pages methodically. Each one revealed something slightly misaligned, a date that didn't match, a note referencing approval that wasn't attached to anything concrete. Nothing dramatic, nothing malicious, just a pattern of moving forward without securing the ground beneath it. My sister's explanations grew longer, then thinner. She referenced past conversations. She mentioned intent. She tried to bridge the gap with words. But words don't fill blank spaces on forms. "We'll need to request additional documentation," the outsider said. "Until then, these actions can't be considered authorized." The phrase "can't be considered authorized" changed the temperature in the room. This wasn't about misunderstanding anymore. This wasn't about family conflict or overstepping. It was about validity, about whether something stood up to scrutiny when someone finally bothered to look. I felt a quiet certainty settle in my chest. Not relief, not satisfaction, just recognition. This was the moment I had been waiting for without naming it. Around the table, reactions varied. Some people looked at my sister with confusion, others with discomfort. A few avoided her entirely, eyes fixed on the papers as if the answers might rearrange themselves if no one acknowledged them. My sister straightened in her chair, trying to recover ground that no longer existed. "There must be something missing," she said. "This was all handled quickly." The outsider nodded. "That's exactly why we need to review it carefully." There was no judgment in her tone, just procedure, and procedure was unforgiving. I watched my sister's confidence fracture in small, precise ways. Her hands moved more. Her explanations circled back on themselves. She stopped making declarations and started making requests. "I can follow up," she said. "I can get what you need." The outsider closed the folder gently. "That would be necessary." Necessary. Not helpful. Not appreciated. Necessary. As the conversation drew to a close, the room felt exposed. Not in a dramatic way, but in the way things do when assumptions have been stripped away and no one is sure what comes next. The narrative my sister had controlled so carefully was unraveling without anyone raising their voice. I knew then that this wasn't about me being believed. It was about something simpler and more powerful. The plans that had been made didn't hold up when examined, and nothing could talk that away. When people began to stand, their movements were slower. Conversations stayed low. No one congratulated my sister. No one thanked her for stepping up. The role she had grown into no longer fit. I remained seated until the room cleared. For the first time, I felt no urge to explain myself. No need to justify my silence or reclaim my voice. The process had done what words never could. As the outsider gathered her things, she glanced at me briefly. Not with sympathy, not with judgment, with recognition. The kind that comes from seeing the truth without being told. My sister had built her certainty on the belief that no one would check. She was wrong. And now, there was one question hanging in the air that no explanation could answer. Where was the consent she had never secured? The silence after that question felt different from all the others. It wasn't awkward or tentative. It had direction. The kind of silence that settles when people realize something irreversible has already happened. No one rushed to fill it. No one laughed it off. The room seemed to lean inward, waiting. I noticed the shift before anyone spoke. Eyes that had been fixed on my sister began drifting elsewhere. Toward the table, toward the folder, toward the outsider who hadn't raised her voice or changed her tone, but now held the center of gravity without trying. Authority had moved quietly. The outsider spoke again, not to accuse, but to clarify. She summarized what had been found so far in plain language. No emotion, no commentary. Just facts laid out carefully, one after another, like items on a list that could no longer be ignored. "There's no documented consent," she said. "There's no completed authorization, and without those, these decisions aren't valid." Valid! The word landed heavily. My sister shifted in her chair. She leaned forward, hands clasped too tightly now, her confidence reshaping itself into urgency. She tried to regain control the only way she knew how, by reframing the situation. "This was a misunderstanding," she said quickly. "We were acting in good faith. Everyone knew what was happening." Her voice carried more insistence than certainty. She was trying to persuade, not explain. But persuasion doesn't work once the truth has been stated plainly. The outsider listened without interrupting, then shook her head slightly. "Good faith doesn't replace consent," she said, "and knowing something is happening isn't the same as agreeing to it." I watched the room absorb that distinction. One of our parents cleared their throat, finally speaking up, but not in the way I had once imagined. There was no defense of my sister, no dismissal of the process. Instead, there was a careful question about what this meant going forward, about responsibility, about consequences. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The family wasn't rallying around her anymore. They were protecting themselves. My sister noticed it too. I saw it in the way her shoulders stiffened, in the quick glance she cast around the room, searching for the support she had taken for granted. It wasn't there, not openly, not anymore. She tried again, softer this time. "We were just trying to help," she said. She didn't object. I felt the familiar pull in my chest, the instinct to respond, to correct that framing. But I stayed still. This wasn't my moment yet. If I spoke now, I would give her something to push against. Silence let her words stand alone, exposed. The outsider didn't look at me when she replied. She didn't need to. "Lack of objection isn't consent," she said, "especially in situations like this." The sentence hung in the air, unchallenged. I could feel the room turning, not dramatically, not all at once, but decisively. People shifted in their seats. Someone avoided my sister's gaze entirely. Another person folded their arms, not in defiance, but in discomfort. The dynamic had changed, and everyone felt it. My sister's voice faltered for the first time. She asked a question, not to clarify procedure, but to delay it. She suggested follow-ups, offered to fix the paperwork, promised to provide what was missing. Her words came faster now, stacking on top of each other, as if speed could reverse momentum. But momentum had already passed her. The outsider nodded politely, then said something that sealed it. "Until proper consent is documented, we'll need to pause any further action." Pause. The word carried weight. This wasn't something that could be smoothed over privately later. This wasn't a family discussion anymore. It was a process, and it had rules that didn't bend for confidence or intention. I realized then that the room hadn't turned toward me. It had simply stopped turning toward her. That was the difference. No one looked to me for validation or leadership. They didn't need to. The truth had already stepped forward on its own. My role wasn't to replace her authority, it was to let it collapse without becoming the target. I stayed quiet. Inside, I felt a strange mix of calm and distance. Not satisfaction, not relief, just a steady understanding that what I had endured quietly was now visible to everyone, without me having to explain a single thing. As the outsider outlined next steps, her voice remained steady, procedural, indifferent to the emotional undercurrents in the room. That indifference was what made it powerful. It meant the outcome no longer depended on who felt justified. My sister sat back slowly, the energy draining from her posture. She nodded at things she would have argued against hours earlier. She didn't meet my eyes. The meeting ended without resolution, but with something stronger: direction. People stood, gathering their things, conversations low and cautious. No one lingered to reassure my sister. No one praised her for handling things. The role she had claimed so confidently had dissolved, and everyone could see it. I waited until the room was nearly empty before standing. Nothing had been fixed yet. Nothing had been resolved. But something had shifted permanently. The assumptions that had protected her were gone. The certainty that had silenced me was gone. And for the first time, the silence in the room wasn't mine. It belonged to the truth, standing where her confidence used to be. No one asked me to speak. The room simply waited. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I felt the shift as clearly as a change in temperature. After everything that had been laid out, after the records had spoken and the process had taken over, the attention that had once orbited my sister drifted toward me without announcement. Not with expectation, with curiosity. For the first time, I wasn't interrupting anything. I could feel my sister's awareness sharpen beside me. She knew it too. The space she had filled so completely was no longer hers by default, and the silence that followed wasn't something she could manage. It wasn't hers to fill. I took a breath, slow and measured, and when I spoke, my voice sounded unfamiliar even to me. Not louder, not firmer, just clear. "I want to clarify one thing," I said. That was all. No preamble, no defense. Every instinct I had learned over the years told me to explain myself fully, to justify my silence, to list every moment I had been excluded. I didn't do any of that. The facts didn't need embellishment now, they were already standing. I was aware of the decisions being discussed, I continued, for some time. The sentence landed quietly, but I felt its effect ripple through the room. My sister turned toward me sharply, her expression caught between disbelief and calculation. She hadn't expected that. She had built her certainty on the assumption that I didn't know. I let the moment settle before continuing. I didn't object, I said, because I wanted the process to be clear. I didn't look at her when I said it. I looked at the outsider, at the table, at the space where the records lay. My words weren't aimed at winning an argument. They were aimed at aligning with what had already been established. There was a pause, not an uncomfortable one, a thoughtful one. My sister spoke next, too quickly. "If you had concerns," she said, "you could have said something." There it was, the familiar framing, the implication that silence was my failure. I turned to her then, finally meeting her eyes. "I chose not to," I said evenly. "Because every time I've spoken before, the focus shifted away from the decisions and onto my reaction. I didn't want that to happen again." I kept my tone neutral, not accusatory. I wasn't recounting grievances. I was stating a strategy. The room absorbed that quietly. My sister opened her mouth, then closed it again. She tried to recover with a softer tone, one that used to work. "We were just trying to help," she said. "You didn't say you were uncomfortable." I didn't respond immediately. I didn't need to rush. For once, time was on my side. "I understand that was your intention," I said, "but intention isn't authority, and help doesn't replace consent." The words weren't mine originally. They had already been said. I was simply confirming them. That was when I saw it happen. The narrative my sister had controlled so carefully didn't just crack. It detached from her completely. Her explanations no longer set the direction. They floated, unsupported, while the room stayed grounded in what had been established. The outsider stepped in again, not to arbitrate feelings, but to reassert process. "Thank you for clarifying," she said to me, then turned back to the group. She outlined next steps calmly, methodically. Review, verification, documentation. Each step measured, each one indifferent to who had spoken the most before. My sister listened in silence, her earlier confidence replaced by something rigid and contained. She nodded where she would have argued. She took notes where she once made declarations. The transformation wasn't dramatic, it was unmistakable. Around us, the family shifted uncomfortably. Not toward me in support, but inward, grappling with what this meant about their own assumptions, about how easily they had accepted convenience over confirmation. I didn't press the moment. I didn't ask for apologies or acknowledgement. I didn't need to. When the outsider finished, the room stayed quiet again. This time the silence felt resolved, like something had found its place. I realized then that my voice hadn't changed the outcome. It hadn't needed to. Everything that mattered had already been set in motion. My words didn't expose anything new. They simply confirmed what the process had revealed. That was the difference. I wasn't fighting to be heard anymore. I was being understood without having to raise my voice. As people began to gather their things, conversations stayed cautious and low. No one approached me with sympathy or praise. That was fine. I wasn't looking for either. What I wanted had already happened. My sister stood slowly, her movements deliberate. She didn't look at me as she left the room. Not out of anger, but out of something closer to recognition. She understood now that my silence hadn't been confusion or surrender. It had been timing. I stayed seated for a moment after everyone else had gone, letting the quiet settle. For the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like something I was enduring. It felt like something I owned. I hadn't waited to be believed. I had waited to be undeniable. The room didn't explode after I spoke. It settled. That surprised me more than anything. I had braced myself for raised voices, for denial, for someone to rush in and soften what had just happened. None of that came. Instead, there was a quiet, heavy pause, the kind that follows when a story has reached its end and no one knows what to say next. The outsider broke it first, not with emotion, but with procedure. She explained what would happen now, step by step, in the same measured tone she had used all along. Reviews would be required. Certain actions would be paused. Documentation would need to be corrected before anything moved forward again. Her words didn't accuse, they didn't console, they simply moved the situation out of the family's hands. That was when I saw my sister begin to lose what she hadn't realized she was borrowing. Support didn't vanish dramatically. It thinned. Conversations that once centered around her authority shifted to practical concerns. People asked what this meant for timelines, for responsibilities, for themselves. No one asked how she felt. No one defended her decisions outright. Loyalty, I realized, is often conditional on comfort. She tried to regain footing in small ways, offering to follow up, volunteering to gather paperwork, speaking carefully now, choosing each word as if it might be weighed later. But the ease she once carried was gone. Her confidence no longer filled the room. It hovered, unsure of where to land. I stayed where I was, physically and emotionally. I didn't step forward, I didn't withdraw, I didn't watch her closely, and I didn't avoid her either. For the first time in a long while, my position didn't need managing. Around us, the family began a quiet reckoning. It wasn't announced. It didn't involve apologies or confrontations. It showed up in the way people avoided eye contact, in the careful phrasing of their questions, in the discomfort that settled when assumptions were brought too close to the surface. I could see them recalculating their own roles, wondering how much they had contributed by staying silent when it was easier. Someone said, "We should have asked more questions, not to me, but to the room." No one disagreed. My sister heard it. I could tell by the way her shoulders stiffened, by the way she nodded without speaking. The consequences she faced weren't dramatic or public. They were isolating. She was no longer the obvious choice, no longer the default voice. People hesitated before agreeing with her now. They checked. They asked. That hesitation was the cost she hadn't planned for. I didn't feel satisfaction watching it happen. What I felt was distance, a clean separation between who I was in this story and who I needed to be going forward. I wasn't there to punish her or reclaim a role. I was there to step back into myself. No one came to me with a grand apology. No one offered a speech about misunderstanding or intent. That absence said more than any words could have. It told me that accountability doesn't always look like remorse. Sometimes it looks like restraint, like people realizing they no longer have permission to decide things for you. As the meeting ended and people began to leave, the dynamic shifted again, quietly but unmistakably. Conversations paused when I approached, not out of discomfort but consideration. Questions were directed to me instead of answered on my behalf. Small changes, but real ones. I noticed my sister watching it happen, her expression controlled but tight. She wasn't angry, she was recalibrating. For the first time, she was navigating a room where her certainty didn't set the tone. I didn't say anything to her. I didn't need to. By the time the house emptied, the air felt different, not lighter, clearer. The kind of clarity that comes after something has been named, even if no one says it out loud. I gathered my things slowly, unhurried. Nothing had been fixed completely. There were still steps ahead, still consequences unfolding. But the core of it was settled. I had my place back, not because I demanded it, but because the system recognized it. As I stepped outside, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't replaying the conversation in my head. I wasn't thinking about what I should have said differently or whether I had been too quiet or too firm. The noise was gone. What remained was a steady sense of self-respect, intact and unnegotiable, the kind that doesn't need defending once it's restored. Nothing had been resolved neatly, but everything had changed. The quiet that followed stayed with me longer than I expected. Not the awkward silence of unfinished conversations, but a calm that settled into my days without asking permission. The house felt different. Rooms that once carried tension now held space. Even the air seemed lighter, as if it no longer had to brace itself for raised voices or hurried explanations. Nothing dramatic happened after that meeting. No apologies arrived in neatly wrapped speeches. No one sat me down to acknowledge what they had done. And strangely, I didn't feel the absence of those things the way I once would have. What changed was simpler and far more telling. People stopped making plans around me. When decisions came up, they paused. Not because they were afraid of me, but because they were finally aware that my presence mattered. Questions were asked instead of assumed. Silence wasn't filled on my behalf. For the first time in a long while, I was included without having to ask. My sister kept her distance. Not out of anger, not out of guilt, but caution. She had learned something she couldn't unlearn. That my silence hadn't been confusion. That it hadn't been weakness. It had been patience, sharpened into something precise. We didn't talk about what happened. We didn't need to. The shift spoke for itself. I thought a lot about silence in the days that followed. About how easily it's mistaken for surrender. About how often women are told that if they don't speak up, they must be accepting what's being done to them. I used to believe that too. I thought silence meant disappearing. I was wrong. Silence, I learned, can be a way of listening with intention, of stepping back far enough to see the full picture, of letting people reveal who they are when they think no one is watching. There was a time when losing my voice in that room felt like losing myself, when being talked over and decided for made me feel smaller each day. But what I hadn't realized then was that silence doesn't erase you unless you believe it does. I didn't need to explain myself anymore. I didn't need to justify why I waited. The truth had done that work for me. What surprised me most was how little I needed validation afterward. I didn't crave acknowledgement or remorse. I didn't need my sister to admit anything out loud. What I needed was my autonomy back. And I had it. Quietly. Completely. There's a kind of power that comes from knowing you could speak, but choosing when it actually matters. Not to prove a point, not to win an argument, but to align yourself with what can't be denied. If you've ever been in a room where your voice slowly stopped carrying weight, you know how painful that erasure feels. You know how tempting it is to fight every assumption the moment it appears. I used to do that. I used to think every silence was a loss. Now I know better. Sometimes, when you no longer have a voice in a room, the wisest choice is to listen, to observe, to let people grow careless in their certainty, to allow the truth to gather strength until it no longer needs your protection. That doesn't mean staying quiet forever. It means choosing the moment that changes everything. I didn't raise my voice to be heard. I waited until I didn't have to. If this story felt familiar, if you've ever been underestimated, talked over, or quietly replaced, you're not alone. And you're not powerless. Your silence doesn't have to be surrender. Sometimes it's preparation. If you feel comfortable, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Have you ever chosen silence on purpose and watched the truth reveal itself without you saying a word? And if stories like this matter to you, if you want to stay with a place where these moments are told with honesty and dignity, consider subscribing. You're always welcome here. Silence didn't erase me. It gave the truth room to speak.